The title, which I gave Barb a while ago, is on the late prehistory of the Mojave Desert, and that was my original intent, and it still is. But in preparing this presentation, I realized that there were some significant changes in the earlier prehistory that I'm going to touch upon. So I'm going to go through that material rather quickly and try and focus on the late prehistory, which is what the abstract is. If this works, yeah. So the abstract is here. Presumably you can read this. I don't need to read it to you. But basically, about 5,000 years ago, people think that the Mojave was abandoned and that it was reoccupied roughly 4,000 years ago by groups commonly known as the Gypsum Complex or Gypsum period people. And it is the basic model is that people moved back into the desert once things started getting a little better, and they reestablished their habitation sites and settlement patterns and basically lived in small villages, ultimately changing through technology to Rose Spring and then late prehistoric and ultimately ethnographic groups. This model is premised on the idea that there are permanent villages dating from beginning about 4,000 years ago in the Mojave Desert. But it seems that there really aren't any. So that then begs a new model of late Mojave Desert prehistory, which is that people did not move back in a full sense, that they continued living on the fringes of the desert and that they utilized the desert on an interim basis, and those uses overlapped between different groups, creating what are then called basically common pool resource zones. And so that is pretty much the new model that I'll outline for late prehistory, and I'll give a brief run through earlier prehistory just as context. But before I do that, I thought I would entertain everybody. I've been doing this for 54 years now. And here I am in 1968 and in 1970. And maybe it's just me, but I think these are hilarious pictures. Well, I'm trying to move on from this. So the Mojave Desert is a hot desert basically above 2,000 feet in elevation. It's often called the high desert, with the Colorado Desert often being called the low desert because it has lower elevations. Mojave Desert has hot summers, as perhaps some of you have noticed, cold winters, and it is windy. Joshua Tree is a major vegetative marker, and over the last X number of years that people have been in the Mojave Desert, there's been variations in climate from the Pleistocene and well into the Holocene. The Pleistocene and early Holocene were wetter and cooler. The middle Holocene, drier and warmer, drier to the point that it does appear that people largely abandoned the Mojave Desert for about 1,000 years. And then there's, after about 4,000 years ago, return to modern conditions in the late Holocene, although there are a variety of other things that happen, such as the medieval climatic anomaly and the Little Ice Age, but those are fairly late in time. So this gives you an idea of where the Mojave Desert is in the Western North America. I presume you can see the cursors. So here's Las Vegas and Barstow and Victorville. San Diego, where I am, is right down here. And right here is Bakersfield, where I spent 20 years at Cal State Bakersfield. Surrounding the Mojave Desert is the great, whoops, boy, this is not working well for me. What? I'm having difficulties, excuse me. Boy, it does not want to cooperate. To the north is the Great Basin Desert, and to the south is the Colorado and Sonoran deserts with the Mojave in the middle. The Great Basin Desert certainly has its dry points, but it also has a basin and range province where there's a great deal more water. So the Mojave Desert is actually pretty dry. It's pretty desolate, as all you have to do is drive around Las Vegas and I mean, outside of the town, and you'll see that it's pretty dry. So this is an example of the Joshua tree. This is pretty green. There's cholla in there too. Actually pretty green. And this is desert scrub. I don't remember exactly what's in the distance there, but this is what a lot of the Mojave Desert looks like. So I thought I'd go over some prehistoric site types because that's pertinent to the new model. So there's a whole variety of possible sites. There's scatters of stone tools and debris, scatters of pottery. There are features. There are habitation sites of various sizes, from villages, some of them quite large actually, to very, very small camps. And of course, there's a great deal of rock art with pictographs. A few pictographs, not all that many really, but mostly petroglyphs in the Mojave Desert. And I'm sure there's other site types too, but this gives you a hint. We'll go through these very quickly. So you have lithic sites that have quarries or lithic scatters. You might have scatters of tools, manufacturing places, or places where tools are abandoned because they're no longer useful. Here you can see just a photograph of a lot of obsidian debris, probably at a quarry or a reduction site. You have pottery scatters. It's hard to see, but there's a mess of pottery laying there. Mostly this is in the eastern portion of the Mojave Desert. The western Mojave Desert has very little pottery. So it has a lot to do, I think, with the Colorado River and those eastern groups, some agriculturalists with pottery, but there's not that much in the western Mojave. You have features. You have various milling features, like this is a bedrock mortar. You have hearths, rock rings such as this. You have cairns. There are burials and cremations that are found, not very commonly, but nevertheless. Features would also include many of the rock art localities would be called features, but we usually classify them a little differently. So these things exist. Habitation sites are where people live for some period of time. You have temporary camps used just for a few times. So they are small with shallow deposits if they have deposits. Some temporary camps are used repeatedly over time, so they become larger. They get many small camps mixed into what appears to be one large camp, but it's actually the result of many smaller ones used over time, sometimes many thousands of years. And so they're quite large and may have deep deposits. And then you have permanent camps with a relatively large number of people used over extended periods of time with large and deep deposits. Sites with large and deep deposits are very uncommon in the Mojave Desert, although they are much more common on the fringes of the desert, and I'll get back to that. And then you have rock art sites, mostly petroglyphs, a few pictographs, and of course geoglyphs. And this is just some examples of those kinds of things. The pictograph or petroglyphs, I believe, are from the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, and the geoglyphs are from the Blythe area. In the Pleistocene Great Basin, it was considerably wetter at that point in time, and they had in the Mojave Desert, which is in the lower part of this illustration, this area here, not this stuff up here, but just down in here, you have the China Lake, Searles Lake Basin here. You have Panamint Lake, which isn't listed, but it's this guy here, Lake Manly. This is Lake Thompson, now Edwards Air Force Base. The Mojave River formed Lake Mannix, which then overflowed into Lake Mojave and Silver Lake, and ultimately into Lake Manly. So you do have a whole series of lakes and rivers. The Owens River goes into the China Lake Basin. A lot more water, 12,000, 10,000, 9,000 years ago, a lot more water in the Mojave. That would, of course, change the vegetation, the biomes and whatnot. It would be a lot wetter. There would be a lot more juniper, probably a lot more pinyon, looking perhaps a little more like the Great Basin Desert. So the current prehistoric sequence is roughly this. There's the idea of a pre-Clovis, in other words, an occupation before Clovis times, roughly at 13,000 years ago, and then the Mojavean tradition, which includes the Lakebed Pattern, which is essentially Clovis, the Lake Mojave Pattern, the Pinto Pattern, and then you go, you can see here that Pinto goes from roughly 10 to 5 and Gypsum from 4, there's that 1,000 year gap here, then to Rose Spring, and then Late Prehistoric, and then you would have the Ethnographic period after that. So is there a pre-Clovis? Well, there's been claims of a pre-Clovis, the Calico site and Lake Mannix and whatnot, but there's really no solid in the Mojave Desert of a pre-Clovis. Apologies to the true believers of Calico and other places, but there really isn't in the Mojave Desert yet. There is, however, good evidence of a pre-Clovis elsewhere in the Americas. There's a 16,000-year-old site in Cooper's Ferry in Idaho. There's stuff in Mexico that appears to be older. In Monteverde in Chile appears to be older. A brand new thing that they've just recently discovered is a foot trackway in New Mexico that has radiocarbon dates, apparently pretty decent ones, on about 21,000. So there's a growing acceptance that there is a pre-Clovis presence in North America, but we haven't seen it in the Mojave Desert, at least not yet. Someday perhaps, but not today. The Lakebed Pattern runs from about 13 to 12. It's Clovis points. There's some occupation sites around China Lake and Lake Thompson. Perhaps they're using some megafauna. There are mammoth remains up there, but directly associating them with human activity is another matter. There's some isolated Clovis points across the desert suggesting that maybe they're living around these lakes in the western part of the desert and then exploring the rest of the desert, but not really establishing habitation there. Of course, all of this could change with a new find, but this is what my thinking is at this moment in time. And then there's some illustration of what Clovis points look like. And here's a map showing where China Lake is. This is Searles Lake. The Clovis is about the relatively larger ones, not that they're large, but they're larger, are around China Lake. There's also at Lake Thompson, that doesn't show on this map, but there's also a relatively important Clovis site there. And then there are just isolated Clovis points scattered about, but the larger sites with the large number of points and maybe some occupational debris around these lakes here, but not in the eastern Mojave Desert. In itself, an interesting pattern. The Lake Mojave pattern follows this, and you move into stemmed points. Lake Mojave or Silver Lake points, as you can see in the illustration. And these sites are found along Pleistocene lake shores and at springs. Now, the lakebed pattern sites are also on lake shores, but not really at springs. And so you have a change in settlement pattern to expand from lakes to include springs, but not really any megafauna. Those things seem to be limited to the lakebed pattern. And Lake Mojave, you see them fairly widely spread, particularly, as you might imagine, at Lake Mojave, where it was first named. And there's also material at Silver Lake and at various other places across the Mojave Desert. The lakebed pattern stuff is pretty sparse. The Lake Mojave pattern stuff is much more widely spread. Not that there's a huge amount of it, but there's more of it. The Pinto pattern is with Pinto points. So again, there's another change in technology here. All of these points so far are probably used either on thrusting spears and or atlatls. So they're dart points, not arrow points. The bow and arrow isn't here yet. Pinto pattern is at occupations on springs and streams, not really lakes. So again, there's a change in settlement patterns. As the desert dries up, the lakes are starting to go away. The springs are still there. There might be some streams that are still flowing. The river is still flowing. So you do get occupations at those water spots. But later in the Pinto pattern, between let's say 6 and 5, roughly, things get real dry there. And so groups with Pinto technology move into the highlands, the San Bernardino Mountains or the Southern Sierra Nevada, or some of the other highland places, and basically ultimately abandon the desert by about 5,000 years ago. And when I say abandon, I mean in terms of like living there full time. They continue to use it on an occasional basis, but they don't live there full time. Now, again, this is a model, so it could be wrong, but I'm going with it tonight. Then you get into the...
So Mark, there's a question.
Sure.
Teresa asks, if Clovis are part of lakebed pattern and stemmed along lake shores, are you finding Clovis at lower elevation than stemmed?
There is a argument about that, particularly at the China Lake Basin. There's been some studies and papers regarding the distribution and elevation of those point types. And there have been pro and con arguments about that, but in my understanding, it's unresolved. So I don't have an answer, is the bottom line. People are aware of this as a possible issue, and it's a very interesting issue, but it's, to my understanding, it's not yet resolved. Hopefully that's a decent answer. So the Gypsum Complex began, maybe 4,000 years ago, and the points, again, you have this technology change from Pinto points to Elko points, and they are also atlatl dart points. And it seems that there's or at least a lot of people believe that there's a reoccupation of the Mojave as conditions improve. And it's commonly thought that gypsum groups came down from the hills and reestablished permanent base camps in the desert, probably at springs or other water sources such as the Mojave River, and that they were generalized hunter-gatherers. This is followed by the Rose Spring period, and again, you have now a technological change. This one, a major technology change, because now you have the introduction of the bow and arrow. And so Elko points or gypsum points are thought to be dart points on atlatls, where Rose Spring points are thought to be arrow points. You have large sites now. You have big middens, some big middens from the Rose Spring period at springs and short-term lakes around the fringe of the desert. You do get Rose Spring period materials in the interior of the desert, as you do get gypsum materials in the interior, but not camps that we know of. And you also get then an extensive use of Coso obsidian. I'll take this opportunity, it's not in this presentation or slide presentation, but the Rose Springs site, which is just north of Ridgecrest in the northern part of the Rose Valley, just before Owens Valley, is the namesake of the Rose Spring points and whatnot. And it's a very interesting site because it is extraordinarily misunderstood. The Rose Springs site was excavated by the Riddells in the 1950s, and they took that material back to UC Berkeley, where Lanning, who was he's a Peruvian archaeologist. He's sitting there at Berkeley with nothing to do, waiting for his permit to go to Peru. And he goes to Heiser and says, hey, I got nothing to do. What should I do? Heiser says, well, here, take this collection from Rose Spring and write it up. So Lanning, who wrote the Rose Spring report, 1963, actually didn't do any of the excavations. He may have actually visited, I don't know, he may not have ever even been to the Rose Spring site. So what he wrote up, of course, was what Riddell had brought back with him. And so one of the major misunderstandings about the Rose Spring site is that there's very little milling equipment at the Rose Spring site that was outlined in Lanning's report. And that absence of milling material was part and parcel of a model of population replacement about Rose Spring people being hunters and not grinders, and then late prehistoric people being more dependent on groundstone technology. So there's a dichotomy between Rose Spring not having groundstone technology and later people having groundstone technology. And then there's an argument built about optimal foraging efficiency and all this kind of, it's a fairly big deal. Well, Robert Yowie went back to the Rose Spring site in the 90s to work on his dissertation, and I was there. I don't know if it was literally the first day, but it may well have been. We walk up to the site, and there's fields of bedrock mortars. There's matates and monos laying everywhere. In Riddell's back dirt, there's complete matate. There's just this huge quantity of milling equipment that's not in Lanning's report. And so anybody who reads Lanning's report doesn't know that there's a lot of this milling equipment at Rose Spring. But there is. Well, what happened? What happened was that the Riddells didn't want to take all those big rocks back with them. So they just left them at the site and just took all of the little stuff. Of course, Lanning didn't know that. Heiser didn't know that. So our understanding of the Rose Spring site as a hunting site is completely wrong, which means that the model derived from that is completely wrong. And a lot of people still don't know that because that's still not published. But I digress. After the Rose Spring period, you get into the late prehistoric period where you get cottonwood and desert side-notched points. And this is typically seen as the foundation of the ethnographic groups and territories in the Mojave Desert. So this is a quick review of the current state of the art, if you will, of the cultural sequence and chronology. So the purpose of this presentation actually is to look at re-examining the gypsum reoccupation of the Mojave. So the premise is that gypsum groups reoccupied the Mojave about 4,000 years ago and established base camps, models of later Mojave Desert prehistory based on that premise. So here's the question, okay, why haven't we identified any gypsum base camps? If they're there, why haven't we found them? Well, there's a couple of possibilities, of course, is they are there and we just haven't found them. Or we haven't found them because they're not there. Those two possibilities. And then following that, well, where are the later Rose Spring and late prehistoric big base camps in the central or in the major portion of the Mojave Desert? Well, we don't have those either. And again, it's possible that we haven't found them. It's possible that they weren't there. So as it is, late Holocene base camp have been firmly identified within the Mojave Desert proper. And while a lot of researchers say, yeah, that's true, but it's just the argument is that, well, we haven't found them yet. They're there, they have to be there, because that's what our model says, but we haven't found them yet. So is that possible? Yeah, of course it's possible, but let's look at it a little differently. What if they're not there? What does that mean? There are large sites, habitation sites along the fringes of the Mojave Desert. Some of them are quite large. In just west of Rosemond, Kern 303 has structures, a cemetery. We did an excavation there in the 1970s, and about a 2.5% sample, which is a pretty big sample compared to most samples. And there's something like 60,000, yes, you heard me, 60,000 shell beads in that 2.5% sample. So there are a number of other sites. There's a fairly large Rose Spring site at Cone Lake. There's a series of what are called villages in the Western Mojave. But all of these sites are on the fringe of the Mojave, not out into the Mojave. There's an exception, and that's the Mojave River corridor. So where you have that water, you appear to have permanent occupations, but all of that is only after about 1,000 years ago. So what do we make of this? This is what we know. Not what we think, or not what we suspect, or not what we hope for, but this is what we know. So what do we make of this? And if you look at the ethnographic Mojave Desert, you see the map there, and you can, anthropologists map ethnographic territories with firm borders. They do that everywhere all the time. There's a firm border between the Kauai Sioux and the Serrano. There it is. You can see it right there. And so north of that is Kauai Sioux territory, and south of that is Serrano territory. Well, but in reality, we know that these are just made up lines. They just drew lines that they don't really have that much actual meaning. And also there are no unassigned areas, as you can see. But people use this as a baseline data set to look at the ethnographic situation, and it's, let's say it's equivocal. So lessons from ethnography. So even though ethnographic Mojave groups are mapped territories, really their primary occupation areas are along the fringes, such as in the Southern Sierra or along the Colorado River. If you look at, for example, if I can go back, yeah, the Kauai Sioux, this is the Southern Sierra Nevada Tehachapi area, and this is the Mojave Desert area. Well, the ethnographic information on the Kauai Sioux is very clear. They live in the Southern Sierra and use the desert on an occasional basis. It's very clear. That's the settlement pattern in ethnographic times. Same thing is true really of the Serrano. We know that of the Serrano. Where are we? Yeah, there's the Serrano, that they're really living in the San Bernardino Mountains and along the Mojave River, and they're using other areas on an occasional basis. In addition, the territories that are claimed by many of the Mojave Desert ethnographic groups, and I'm sure that this is true probably across the world, overlap significantly, often seen by ethnographers and anthropologists as conflicting claims. Well, how could this be Serrano territory? but also Cauayasu territory. Maybe the borders changed through time. Maybe there was a war. Maybe there's these explanations. And all of these things are quite Eurocentric from the standpoint that, first of all, you have to have defined borders. We do. Borders are very, very, very important to us. And so, you know, since they're important to us, we think they must be important to everybody. Whoops, I don't know how that happened. But that's not necessarily true. We also know that the river Serrano lived along the Mojave River, but were tethered to the river Oasis. They had to live right there, but they used the surrounding desert on an intermittent basis. The area to the east of Victorville and south of Barstow, that whole big desert area there, was an area known as Temtac. It was a named area. So looking at the Serrano and the Cauayasu and the and others, it makes perfect sense to see these overlapping areas as common pool resource zones used by many groups. And if you look at, this is an example of an ethnographic study from the 29 Palms area. So in the middle there is the 29 Palms Marine Corps base. And you can see that the lines of who claimed what are just everywhere. So how do you sort this out? And again, we have this somehow built-in desire to make sure that the lines are, you know, that there aren't overlap, that this territory belongs to them and the other territory belongs to the other guys or whatever. But you can see that it doesn't work that way in reality. So if much of the desert then is common pool resource areas, that would explain all of this. It's consistent with that model. A common pool resource area is a geographic region anyone can use. You can obtain resources, geographic space for trade or ritual, specific place, go to specific places important to groups. I'm sure that there are rules that apply. We don't know what they are, but I'm sure that there are rules. A contemporary analogy is our settlement system. We have common pool resource zones. I mean, you live in your house, right? People can't just walk into your house, but we share a lot of other space: stores, churches, parks, public land, BLM land, Forest Service, national parks. We share a great deal of space, and they're just common pool resource zones. We use them too. So the Mojave Desert, the environment is not homogeneous. You just, you know, it looks kind of all the same, kind of, but if you pay closer attention, you can see that there's pinyon here, but not there. There's mesquite here and not there. The desert is actually quite patchy, as most places are. There are a few permanent or perpetual year-round resource locations. Most resources, though, are found in very specific places or patches on a seasonal basis and easy to predict. You can predict pinyon a year away. You know where the pinyon is going to be next year. You can do that if you know what you're looking at. Some patches are transitory, appearing infrequently or temporarily, difficult to predict, a rainstorm or a sudden flood or something like that. A very few places contain resources for extended periods due to unusual conditions. Perpetual patches like rivers, springs, quarries, abiotic resource locations where rock is, that's not the environment's not going to impact where the obsidian is, for example. And you're going to have large sites and camps at those places. You're also going to have perpetual patches where you have ritual places, because the rock art isn't going to move depending upon the weather, and so these things will remain important irrespective of local conditions. And here's an example of an important site in the eastern Mojave Desert called Council Rocks. It's a birthing locality, we think. There's a birth canal depicted here, and it's hard to see, but it's smoothed from so many people sliding through it in prehistory. Then you have recurring patches such as pinyon or mesquite or yucca. You know where those places are. They're not going to move, or at least not very quickly, and you can predict them. And so you're going to go there every year or every other year or whatever. And so you're going to get large seasonal sites at those places. And then you have limited resources such as maybe grass seeds. You know where the hunting areas are, you know where the deer are going to be, for example. You may not know precisely that the deer are going to be in that particular canyon, but you know roughly where they're going to be. So you're going to have small camps or traps or kill sites in those locations. And then you have biotic raw materials, basketry making materials, and those kinds of things that you can collect, and those can be done very quickly. And so you'll have very small day camps or day places associated with those kinds of patches. And here's an example of pinyon. There's a lot of pinyon trees there. There's some mesquite, there's some rice grass, there's some yucca. These things are, they're not homogeneous, but they're common. Transitory patches are short-term biotic resources such as stands of grass seeds from unusual rain, or shrimp in lakes, or unusual abundance of insects. You might occasionally have a horticultural plot that somebody decides to, well, there's enough water there, I think maybe I'll plant some corn or whatnot. They certainly didn't do very much of that, and that would be very late in time. Here's some brine shrimp. These little guys, and grasshoppers, you can get a lot of them pretty quickly. Then there are long-term exceptions. Occasionally, conditions will change and a new resource patch will emerge and last for a considerable time. Great example is the Cronese Basin. Sometimes the Mojave River gets diverted into the Cronese Basin, filling up West Cronese and East Cronese lakes. And it can be there for 100, 200 or longer years. The basin then would be occupied during wet times. You get large sites there. Here's the Cronese lakes are right here. Mojave River gets diverted away from Lake Mojave and fills the lakes occasionally. Here is East Cronese Lake with a whole lot of water, and you can see from the photograph, this is fairly recent in time, so it still happens to where you get a lot of water, and that will last for several years, and you might get enough water to last much longer than that. You get, there are known shell middens along the shores of both East and West Cronese. Fish would have also been present, lots of mesquite. So you get large population aggregations there utilizing those resources. Cronese has been investigated a number of times, and while it is well known, everybody kind of knows about it, but there aren't very many reports on it, which is unfortunate. And as far as we know, it was all of these occupations are late in time. In other words, they're not gypsum. Here's a Anodonna, I think, at Cronese, one of the sites at Cronese. And then you have opportunistic patches. You run across a mountain sheep on the trail, or you find resources when you're just monitoring or whatever. You just kind of accidental opportunistic kinds of things, and you would have the resulting archaeological signature would be very small camps or processing sites. So based on that, I would make the argument, or have made the argument, that people did move out of the desert about 5,000 years ago, roughly, into higher and wetter places along the fringe of the desert. And then that instead of reoccupying the desert on a permanent basis, as was the previous model. They basically just continued living on the fringes. They just stayed there and then used the desert as common pool resource zones for particular purposes, particular resources, particular ritual locations, and the like. This model explains the absence of gypsum in later base camps. It's consistent with the ethnographic settlement pattern. It's consistent with what relatively little is known about the ethnographic common pool areas in the Mojave. And it explains why there's so many overlapping territorial claims, because multiple groups use the same place, and they, the ethnographers would ask the Coyote, hey, did you ever go to Rogers Lake? And they'd say, oh yeah, sure, we went there. And then they'd ask the Serrano, did you ever go to Rogers Lake? Oh, sure, we went there. Doesn't mean it was Serrano territory. Doesn't mean it was Coyote territory. I would argue it means that it's a common use resource zone. And then you have these late villages along the fringe of the western Mojave Desert. Cone Lake site is in here. I think number one right here is the Kern 303 site. And then there's a whole series of other sites that are along the fringes here. So this would be the new settlement proposal, new settlement pattern. So you have the core, for example, the core Kawayasu area, and then you have these common pool resource zones in between these groups. The River Serrano here, and then here's Temtac and the Mountain Serrano there, and then the Mojave and Chemehuevi in this area with, if you look at this, you can see that much of the Mojave Desert is actually common pool resource zones. Now, there's still going to be sites there. There's still going to be people there through time, and there's going to be repeated use of certain places where there's consistency in resources, or important ritual places, or important raw material places, such as certain kinds of stones and things like that. So you're still going to find lots of archaeology, but not permanent occupation is the argument. And so this new model posits a different view of the late Holocene occupation of the Mojave. It is unhindered by the premise of base camps, meaning that archaeologists can then better focus their research into other issues such as intergroup cooperation and politics. How are these resource areas managed? The use of ritual space, foraging theory, et cetera, resource use, et cetera. And of course, it is testable, and being testable, it's subject to revision or refutation. Das Ende.
All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple questions here. You had mentioned 60,000 shell beads. Does that imply there's a trade network? Was there?
Well, there is no report on that site. That is an absolutely enormous number of beads, particularly for the Mojave Desert. Now, maybe on the coast, you would get those kinds of numbers, but at the Cone Lake site, which is not that far away, we had a few beads, and people get excited, and rightly so. They get excited. Well, there's 12 beads at my site, or something like that. Well, those are actually very small numbers compared to the further closer to the coast. But what is really odd, I think, is that the Kern 303, which is a site in the desert, has that many shell beads. So they're tied in somehow, some way, big time to coastal things. But that doesn't seem to translate any further to the east. And it may be that it's because they don't live further to the east. Those are common pool resource zones, and they just don't take 60,000 beads with them when they go down to the playa to get mesquite or something.
That makes sense. And then, and I think this is kind of something that you said should be researched, but the common use idea suggests the different groups trusted each other and maybe coordinated on use.
There's got to be some rules. I mean, we have common pool resource zones, and we have rules. For instance, I know in some instances, the spring might be in somebody's specific territory. I know this is true in the eastern Mojave with the Chemehueve. So if you want to use that spring, if you're not Chemehueve, and if you want to use that spring, you have to ask permission. Permission is always given, but you have to ask permission. So if you don't ask permission, then you're going to be in some trouble. But if you do ask permission, that's always granted. So that's an example of the type of rules that might apply. And we just have very little information on this, or at least I do.
Right. It's hard to find in the archaeological record as well.
Permission
And those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Let's see. We've got somebody in the chat, and I may pronounce this wrong, but going back to the Cronese Lake, you showed what would the water be like there? Would it be turbid and thick? Would prehistoric tribes be able to survive off of it?
I guess that means is it drinkable? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the tolerance or the chemistry of the lake bed to say that it's going to have this kind of material in that water. I don't think it would be turbid. So it'd probably be. I'm just guessing. I'm just speculating now. So maybe I should just not speculate.
Understood.
Remember that, but you also have theoretically, right, the rivers flowing into it. So, and there might be springs associated. I don't know. We don't know about that much about it.
Right. So when the Riddells did their recording and resource collection, they didn't take photographs of the ground stones, or were photographs not something that they provided in their collection?
I have not seen the Rose Spring collection that the Riddells did. It's probably still at Berkeley, and I haven't seen the records. I don't know. All I can tell you is that when Lanny went to write it up, he didn't know about the groundstone. So I'm going to say that it's not in the notes, or that maybe it is in the notes and he missed it. Maybe there are photographs and he didn't see it in the folder. I can't explain it, other than they didn't take it with them. It was all there still at the site. And when we walked up, we were shocked at how much groundstone there was, because we knew all about the model that was based on an absence of groundstone at that site.
Mm-hmm.
And it's completely wrong. Everything derived from that is completely wrong. Oops.
All right. Do we have
That's a
any
scientific term, by the way, that feel free to use that.
I think that's important. I mean, the more people can understand the importance of their work and how their work influences interpretation and the archaeological record, and how we contribute to that. I think it's very important, especially for students, to see that something like that has happened and what kind of impact, ripple effect it has.
Yeah, quite the ripple effect. And because that material still isn't published, most people, and unless they're listening to me gripe about it, are completely unaware of this. And so the model that they read based on this, they think is still good. It's not.
All right. Do we have any more questions? You can put it in the Q&A here. All right. So I know a lot of the images that you shared of the typical site types are sites that we monitor in
Sure.
Nevada. So I know a lot of our volunteers go out and they check on those things. It's, you know, very relevant to everything that we're doing. And I appreciate you coming up with a new model and challenging old assumptions. I think that's very important that we have fresh eyes on material and that we accept that we're not always correct. That's the science of it, that we can go back with new information and change and, you know, how we think things happened.
Yeah, that's how it's supposed to work.
I know, it doesn't always work that way.
No, it doesn't.
I do have somebody in the chat here. It's Teresa. What are some of your top research questions to test cooperative use areas versus cultural core areas using archaeological data? That's a tough question.
That's really a good question. Are there any other questions?
Well, do you have any top research questions?
No, I have not gotten past the model.
Okay.
I have not developed those things yet. So I haven't really, I'm a little eclectic in what I get involved in. And so I'm on to other things right now.
Okay.
I'm writing, actually, my major project right now is writing up a large excavation that was done in 1970 and 1971 in the southern Sierra Nevada at a core Kawayasu winter village. And that I've been doing that for almost I've been working on this for almost a year now, and I've gotten the catalog close. It's just ASA went out there and they dug all this stuff in the 50s and then dispersed it among the members, and so our records of it are meager. And then Antelope Valley College worked there in 70 and 71, which is the second photograph that you saw of me, the bottom photograph, because I was the crew chief on that excavation, which is why I feel an obligation to write it up. I wasn't the director. I mean, I was 18 at the time. So, but I have an institutional memory of the excavation. So if I don't write it up, it's not going to get written up probably ever, and certainly not with someone with institutional memory. So that's what I've been working on.
Yeah, and for any students out there, it's not just the excavation, it's the report writing. It's what we need. We need that data. And I do want to say, Teresa said, you know, if you do have those research questions, let us know so we can hit the Mojave running. Well,
Teresa, it's now your job to come up with those research questions.
I'm sure she will.
That's the penalty for asking me a question I can't answer.
All right, anybody else got any questions or comments? All right, give them a second. All right, well, I do want to extend a huge thank you to you for going over this material with us today and taking time out of your Friday evening. I learned a lot, and I know everybody else on here did as well. So again, we appreciate your work and sharing that with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's fun, you know, I like doing this stuff. So,
well, good. All right, well, thank you, and good night to everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. Cheers, everyone.